I will keep us going. Let's take a moment together to acknowledge where it is that we are residing from as a part of Aaliyah's work in building an anti-racist culture. We want to take a moment to honor the people whose land that Aaliyah inhabits. In our efforts of building a pathway of truth and reconciliation, we believe it's our responsibility and honor to acknowledge the sacred and unceded land that we inhabit that was stolen from the people that originally resided in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we are, which belonged to the first peoples of the Dakota. There are 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota, and we ask you to join us in our process of becoming educated about the people whose land we reside on and recognize the history that brought us to where we are today. We celebrate the resiliency and respect the sovereignty as they continue to show strength in their ways of living and connection with the land and the water. And we pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Of course, we want to move our acknowledgement into action and justice. And there are a few tools, links that will post in the chat that might be helpful in your own research and learning about the history where you reside. And additionally, there are more information if you're interested in exploring further land acknowledgement. So in addition to building an anti-racist culture, we ask over the next hour, we're happy to be called in if there is something that we say that goes against our values on anti-racism. And we also will compassionately and respectfully call you in. So we want to create that space together. Here's our agenda. I'll offer a brief introduction to Aaliyah so that the participants here who aren't familiar with our work, can learn about us briefly. Then we, like I mentioned, have Janae Harvey and Judge Nickel joining to talk about a very interesting experiment they did with 4 questions and 7 judges in the state of Iowa. We have Isabel Blanco to talk about her experience in leading the states of Georgia and South Carolina in a past season of her life. And she'll share wisdom with us on how she was able to do work with judges in order to engage them towards family preservation approaches. Feel free to ask questions throughout. You can either chat us, or if you have a burning question, just unmute yourself and ask it, and Anna will help make sure that we get those answered. Aaliyah is a Minnesota-based national nonprofit. We like to think of ourselves and behave in a way that we describe as a do tank rather than a think tank. We offer consultation, training, coaching. We submit publications. We convene people together, really for the purpose and goal of obsoleting child welfare as we know it, and by creating and supporting new approaches that keep, as you can see here, youth safely with, not from, their families. So we work on a know better, do better, be better approach, and that is changing your mindset to change your practice, which leads to transformation. 5 years ago this year, we hosted a 3-day design event in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. You might recognize some of the faces on the screen. We invited 100+ designers from across the country with all types of personal and professional and overlapping experience with the child welfare system to answer this question: how might we redesign a better child welfare system? So the punchline to that whole event was, there is already a perfect child welfare system, and that's people's families. So we don't have to build a new child welfare system, thank God. But what we do need to do is help to support and the child welfare systems that already exist, and that is the families. So what we did, where we emerged from that event was with a set of guiding principles. So that you can see here is around the relational connections as sacred. It's about intergenerational well-being. It's about sharing power and trusting the wisdom in children of families, and insisting on racial equity and radical inclusion. We knew these would be the elements of the thing that we're trying to create. And ultimately, here's our big, when we don't know what to do, we do what love would do. Well, we just say that all the time to ourselves. What is the loving thing that we could do in this situation? So we have these ideas, these concepts, and how do we turn those into a thing on the ground? How do we practice to that? So we convened a 5 jurisdiction cohort over the 3 years, which represented the jurisdictions in Wisconsin and North Dakota and the county in Maryland. We also had amazing lived experience professional guides to help us along the way. And what you are hearing today is some of the wisdom that we learned from that process. On our website, you can learn a lot more about Aaliyah and our work, and specifically about the work of the cohort. We published 3 case study reports, all available for download, or you can just flip through it online, and we invite you to reference those throughout. One of the big things that we learned of how you actually go from the things that you don't want to do to the things that you do want to do, there's lots of them. What we might focus on today is a theme that emerged in that you simply make the old way harder. Make it harder for you to do the thing you don't want to do, and make it easier to do the things that you do want to do. And in particular, we learned some lessons and had some experiences with the really important role and relationships that we build with judges. So what I'm going to do now is to toss it to our dear friend and colleague, Janae Harvey. And she and Judge Nickel will be sharing about the experiment that they did, as I mentioned earlier, about 4 questions that 7 judges participated in. And we will share more information about that. Janae.
Great, thank you, Katie. So good to see you. Okay, if I steal the screen, yes?
Please do, off you go.
Okay. It's not as fun to steal it if you say, yes, please, go ahead.
Don't you dare, Janae, don't you dare.
Well, in that case, I will. I can't see, and I have no visibility now on comments or anything like that. So please help facilitate that space for me. All right.
Sure.
So I think it'd be what I would want this convening to be aware of. In Iowa, we are really far into our Family First implementation. And when I talk about that, I'm speaking about the really technical funding aspects of the federally driven legislation that we know is the Family First Preservation Service Act. But I am also, more importantly, speaking about a philosophy: family first always. Those family connections, strengthening and preserving those family connections is really what we are leading with here in Iowa. And we have some pretty impressive data to show the manifestation of some of that good work that we're up to, that I'm really proud of. And Aaliyah has been such a key partner in our Family First implementation here in Iowa. So eternal gratitude to their work and partnership. Just kind of setting the tone for this conversation. Whenever I'm talking about Family First, we simplify it with those 5 words at the top of the screen: children do best in families. Whenever possible, children are going to do best in their own families. So that's our commitment here. And I am very fortunate to have some key judicial collaboration here in Iowa with people such as Judge Nickel. So glad she's with me here today. And what really got going here in Iowa in this kind of really, really simple, but very innovative way that we were really trying to make it harder to do the wrong thing. It came when Judge Nickel and I were sitting at a table together, and we listened to Amelia Frank-Meyer speak. And what she was talking about, and I'm not going to tell Judge Nickel's story because we're glad that she's here with us. She can talk about the impact that it had on her. But what I will tell you is what she and I struggled with as we sat at that table together is we thought about the challenges in Iowa when a social worker or a county attorney reaches out to a judge and says, you know, I think I need to remove a child. And in Iowa, that authority rests with the court. And judges are expected to, in that moment, make a decision, whether it's at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. A judge says yes, or a judge says no. And what really resonated for me as Judge Nickel and I were speaking is another judge at a different point had said to me, You know, Janae, I always, I don't feel good about any removal, but I have to tell you, I don't know what else to do. I'm not the one who's been in the home. I've never met the parents sometimes. I haven't seen the kids. What I have is a social worker who I have to believe is doing their best and hardest work. And they are the ones asking me to remove. I don't really feel like I can call balls and strikes from up in the bleacher seats, truthfully. I don't want to rubber stamp those decisions. I don't have a lot of other tools though. And what I ended up doing is matching up the experience of that particular judge with what I was hearing from some of the social workers in the field who said, I don't always want to ask for a removal, but when there's some risk and I'm not really sure what else to do, that is not my legal authority in the state of Iowa. That is up to a judge. It is my job to ask. It is the judge's job to evaluate. So really, we're in a bit of a system conundrum that both the judge was looking to the social worker to effectively make a decision, and the social worker is really looking to the judge to effectively make a decision. And unfortunately, what was happening is probably to some degree, some removals were occurring that didn't need to take place. And then also, just importantly, not only were some removals taking place that didn't need to happen, where kids go once they are legally removed and in that in a formal foster care episode, whether we're able to keep them with relatives or fictive kin matters almost just as much as whether they were removed in the first place. So that also mattered a lot to us. As we embarked on a really kind of a DIY simple pilot. So the setup of this pilot is through the presentation with Aaliyah, she mentioned 4 different standards that she would expect to happen prior to any removal being approved. And this was really interesting because as she talked about these 4 specific standards, it very quickly translated for us as something that could be operationalized and operationalized at the judicial level, because judges have the authority to grant a removal or not. And here are those 4 questions. So you can see, maybe it's 5 questions if you count the question, what is the danger? We don't usually do that, but the 4 exact questions, and what we did in our pilot is we enlisted 7 judges around the state. So different areas of the state were enrolled in this pilot. And we asked these 7 judges to ask these 4 questions prior to granting any removal. So literally we printed and laminated these questions, handed them out to some people, they put them up by them, and anytime somebody said, I think I need to remove these kids, the judge agreed to say, what can we do instead to remove the danger instead of the child? Second question, can someone the child or family knows move into the home to remove that danger, to really mitigate that danger? Can the caregiver and child go live someplace else, maybe with a relative or fictive kin to mitigate the danger? Or could the child move temporarily to live with the relative, with relatives or fictive kin? And you can see Judge Nickel at the bottom acknowledging her work in creating these questions, but also Judge Owens, who's also a juvenile judge here in Iowa, and then Amelia, as I already mentioned. So what we did is we had these 7 judges agree to ask these 4 questions each time these removals were put in front of them. And you can see the time frame under which these questions were utilized was December 2019 to March 2020. So over that 4-month period of time, these judges collectively received 83 requests to remove children. When they asked those 4 questions, they approved the removal 44 times. Okay, so let's stop there. I don't want to look at the other data points yet. So approximately half of those removals, they still approved. But it's really important to do a time period comparison with those same judges. So if you look at the 4-month period from August 2019 through November 2019, which immediately preceded the time period in which we did the pilot, we don't know how many requests were asked because that's not a data point I can pull from a system. All we knew is that 99 times these judges over a corresponding period of time had granted removals. Okay, so we went from 99 removals, same set of judges. I can't be sure that the same set of cases were obviously in front of them, but it's approximate. So 99 removals down to 44 removals. So really big. The other thing that then I want to walk you through a little bit is when those removals were approved, those questions were clearly kind of teeing up a different type of consideration and mentality with the social workers, because the social workers are then tasked with finding the placement where those kids who have now been removed. You can see without those 4 questions, 42% of the time the kids went with relatives, 9% with fictive kin, 34% with licensed foster parents, and 13% of the time with shelters. So not only did they remove only 44 times during the pilot, 55% of those removals went with relatives, 11% with fictive kin, and maybe what's most key for me, none went to shelter. That's a really big deal. Okay, so let me pause. I can see there's chat things, but I can't pay attention to it, so.
Do you know what, Janae, there's one direct question in particular that is, what was the outcome for those removed versus those who were able to stay with relatives and fictive kin? I don't know that that is under the sort of the purview of this particular study, but that was maybe other things that you're looking at.
Yeah, so I can't speak to this specific cohort, what maybe the longer term outcomes were. I can tell you that this effort, which we have seen spread among many of the judges. So it is not limited to these 7 judges. Now we have a number of judges who, through just kind of what we call positive peer support, have adopted this practice as well. This, in conjunction with evidence-based programs we have in Iowa, along with something that we call child safety conferences we've initiated, we have seen a remarkable reduction in our overall removal rate. So for instance, one of our service areas, which 2 years ago was close to 8 kids per 1,000 going into foster care, today they're down around 3. So 3 kids per 1,000. So I cannot speak to this specific cohort, but I can tell you in Iowa, across the board, our rates of removal are going down, our lengths of stay in foster care are getting shorter, and we're doing a much, much better job of keeping kids with relatives and fictive kin, which at least anecdotally, we know the research tells us, rates of stability go up, positive outcomes increase when you're able to do that as a system. There are other specific questions or comments I should be reacting to or anything?
There was another one in particular, and I can see that Judge Nickel spoke to part of that. How was shelter defined in Iowa? Maybe that's for you, Janae. And then does the Iowa judiciary use the safety guide framework, specific safety threats, child vulnerability, protective factors? And what do the questions appear to connect to that framework?
Great. So I'll talk about shelter a little bit, and Judge Nickel can chime in on what is the kind of judicial framework and some of that language around the assessment of risk and danger and how we think about threats. So shelter in Iowa is supposed to be temporary residential care. There's no treatment at shelter. According to how we have designed shelter, it's supposed to be 20 days or less. We shoot for the shortest length of stay in shelter as possible. Unfortunately, sometimes kids do overflow well beyond those 20 days as we've had it designed. But shelter is temporary care, usually while we're trying to either locate relative, family, licensed foster family. Sometimes it's used a little bit like respite. Sometimes if a foster family needs a break and the kid can go pretty quickly back there, they need to go back in under 47 hours. But we have in Iowa, so we're a state of about 3.5 million people. We have 143 shelter beds in the entire state. And typically we have about 20 empty, and they are at different locations around the state. So that's why we always plan on having some beds empty because capacity ebbs and flows in different parts of the state at different times.
I want to make sure that we get our questions answered, but I would just love to hear from Judge Nickel and your experience with utilizing these questions and what kind of changed for you. And again, I'll see that I can pull these specific questions out.
So Janae, are you going to finish your PowerPoint or is it my turn?
You can go ahead. I only have some data.
Okay, well, what I would like to say is Janae is absolutely right. There was a weird dynamic going on in that, you know, as judges, generally people only call us and ask us to do something if they want us to do something. So when a child protection worker would call us, we believed they had done all the things they needed to do and they were asking for a removal. But I think there are a lot of them who felt like they were asking a removal because maybe their supervisor thought that, or maybe they were, I hate to say, people sometimes try to cover their butt. I think that there was this sense of, I have to call for a removal, but I really think there's something else I could do. And the court thinking you're the social worker. I think that one of the things the 4 questions comes to is 2 heads are better than 1. And often when I ask the 4 questions, the social worker comes up with the solution. Today, when I ask the 4 questions, normally they have asked themselves the 4 questions before they call. And so it is unusual that they don't have an answer to all those things. Although what I will say is occasionally as we talk through it, ideas that hadn't occurred to me and hadn't occurred to the social worker come up as we're talking through it, which is exactly what we wanted to have happen. I'll back up a little. When I was with Ms. Harvey in Minneapolis and heard Amelia Frankmeyer for the first time, it was just a taste. It was like a 15-minute. The program was running long. She had to shorten her remarks. Very disappointing for some of us. But I'll tell you, in that 15 minutes, she said the word mortal wound. And let me just tell you, mortal wound. I went home. I put a little sticky note that said mortal wound. It's on my phone at my office. It's on every phone I have at my house. I actually still have a landline. I hate to admit it. But my husband says, we have to take the mortal wound stickers down before Thanksgiving because I don't want my family to come over and see all these mortal wound stickers. But that's so that at 2 o'clock in the morning when I got these calls, I would think mortal wound and maybe ask some questions. I know that I had the wonderful opportunity. The Department of Human Services made Amelia Frankmeyer available to their workers and the judiciary. And I know that it made a huge difference to us that that we got to hear her kind of in a larger hour-and-a-half time frame. And it was very meaningful. I drove home from that seminar thinking I never want to remove another child. I know my colleague Bill Owens, who saw her in Cedar Rapids, went home and said the same thing. I got to never remove another child. And that's kind of the conversation I had with Ms. Harvey when we were in Minneapolis. I got to never remove another child. Removing a child is so horrific, we should just never do it. And then while we're sitting there, just that weekend we were in Minneapolis, that 2 days we were in Minneapolis, I got a call to remove a kid. And I really had to think through how could we avoid it? How could we avoid it? But I think there are some occasions where safety demands that you do a removal. And the beauty of the 4 questions is that it's the safeguard. Do you really have to remove the kid? And I'll tell you, since we started talking about the 4 questions, I have started using number 1 more. And I think most judges are willing to remove the danger instead of the child. Like often they remove somebody in a domestic abuse situation. But you know what? We can remove parents who are actively using drugs. If there's a safe parent or a safe adult in the home, we can ask the other parent, we can order the other parent to leave. And so we have to get creative about this. Are there other ways we can take the danger out of the home instead of the child? And new ideas about how the child can stay where they are, stay in the school, stay in their church. I mean, new ways about how we can keep kids at home and take seriously mentally ill parents and put them in a program where they can get a handle on their bipolar disorder or get a handle on their psychotic break or go to inpatient substance use treatment. I mean, there are lots of ways we can remove the parent. And you know, sometimes removing the danger is like a 4-week period. Can grandma come stay for 4 weeks? Can aunt come stay for 4 weeks? And I don't think that's a question that many certainly courts are not asking people, but I think that there are social workers who while that solution seems ideal, you know, when you're at somebody's house in the middle of the night talking about removing their children, they aren't thinking, oh, let's call my sister all the time. And so having those, and they're hard conversations, even when it's not the middle of the night. Can we call your sister, brother, cousin, mom, and say, we need your help? It's hard. And that's where the social work part comes in, doing that strength-based, positive work with people who are in crisis, which I know is very hard. But having those kinds of conversations, I will tell you, the social workers I have are brilliant and they think up great ideas. I think they have often felt like they were in this box. Often the court felt like they were in a box. And this idea that we're going to have this dialogue every time you call, you know, and sometimes there's really should be a fifth question other than what is the danger? And the fifth question is, if the child is old enough to communicate, and I'm talking about like a 5 or a 6-year-old even, ask the child, where do you think you could go for tonight just till we can figure out what's going on here? The child often has the answer, and they're often the person who we don't even ask. And so I encourage people to ask children, and I think that's really becoming more of the practice. You don't have to parentify them or make them think they're the adult or responsible, but you can just ask them for that information that they are uniquely the keeper of. I think it's exciting. I think that, you know, sometimes we don't have to do a removal when somebody calls anymore. The department can engage in a safety plan and families can work together. It's hard. Sometimes you make decisions. There is some risk involved in trusting families. Some risks are more comfortable than other risks. I don't really want to say it out loud, and I'm going to knock on wood. So far, the risks that I've taken in the 7 counties I have in northern Iowa, we haven't had, you know, those front page of the newspaper stories that nobody wants that. Nobody wants a bad result for a child or family. But sometimes you have to make some decisions. Playing it safe creates the same mortal wound that doing something you must do creates. And I don't think, you know, when you listen to kids who have lived experience in our foster care system and you say to them, I had to play it safe here. I had to make this call on the side of doing, you know, I had to, you know, if it's 50-50 in my mind, the child and the family have to win that. If it's 50-50. And, you know, the legal standard in Iowa is that, you know, you got to have substantial evidence. And so if it's 50-50, the law requires that the family and the child win. And I'm not going to tell you there are days that doesn't feel uncomfortable, because there sure are. But you may have to you may have to give up a little bit of your safety. And the other thing I think to myself is, you know, I've been involved in child welfare law since 1990. And so I've seen those disrupted adoptions, and I've seen kids who we've protected from their parents and given them foster parents that were worse in ways. Kids who have really suffered, even with good foster parents, kids who have suffered under this welfare system. And so I'm not even so sure when we say better safe than sorry, we know what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And so the exciting thing about the 4 questions is that it worked everywhere we did it. And I would tell you that the 7 judges, all who I admire greatly and work with on lots of different projects, we're all very different, our approach to things. But, and some, I know Judge Owens met with the department before he even asked any questions and said, these are the questions I'm going to ask you. I just started asking questions, these questions. I've always been a question asker. But in every district in our state, well, not every, but almost every district in our state, every place we've done this, it has had a huge impact on the children and families and the court. And I think it also has created a sense of shared responsibility between the court and the department, which I think has led to them. I mean, I think they're still calling, but they're not calling and saying, we got to remove this child. They're calling and saying, I have the safety concern. Removal's one of the things we should talk about, but let's talk about these other things too. And I think that it's amazing. And I am a little bit sad that because of COVID, the judges who practice in juvenile court have not gotten together like we usually do. Usually we are physically together twice a year, asking each other hard questions. And I think if we had done that, and when we do that, I think we'll have a better spread, for lack of a better word, of the 4 questions, because we need that to happen. We need everybody to ask these questions at that first phone call. And my friend Judge Pattison always says, we need to ask these questions every time a child is in front of us in a courtroom and they're not living at home. And he's right.
Judge Nickel, thank you so much for that. We just have about 1 or 2 minutes before we want to toss it over to our colleague Isabel, but just wanted to see to bring up a couple of questions that were in the chat, and the ones that we don't get here, we'll of course make sure to save the chat and get back to the folks who had those questions. There is one that says, if the parent doesn't agree to leave, how can we order it? And then also a question about DAs. How have DAs responded to this type of experience approach? In my experience, they've wanted to stay in or reinforce the box.
I think Judge Nichols should speak to the court's authority to require somebody to leave the home, because that may be particular to Iowa law. But I will say the intersection of safety plans, which is what we are using in part. Again, we are using a multi-pronged strategy in Iowa in order to reduce our rates of placement in foster care, shortening those lengths of stay. I'm not going to point to one initiative like the 4 questions or one initiative like our child safety conferences to say that's the thing. It's kind of all of these things in connection. Our safety plans, we can put them in place with the family without court oversight, but we do have a requirement for our staff. If we have a plan in place for at least 45 days, we must alert the county attorney. So what that usually looks like in practice is if we've been able to maintain safety for a child for 45 days already and the plan's working, that sometimes is enough for the county attorney to go, well, why would we file charges here? Or why would we take this family to court? Or maybe sometimes a county attorney says, Thank you for letting me know. And I think I need to get ahead of this and file a petition in court on this family, but it does give us a little bit of space to do social work with families prior to having more kind of punitive actions happening. We want an opportunity to provide services whenever possible. Some families, day one, we need to get court involved. That makes sense. But we know in child welfare from lessons learned, there's a lot of ways that we can support and stabilize families without taking more of an antagonistic role with them. But Judge Nickel, do you want to answer the question about how can you get somebody to leave the home who doesn't want to go?
We have the authority under Iowa Code to remove a parent from the home, from their home, just like a domestic abuser. If there's a safety concern that we can identify, we can exclude the parent. Traditionally, we're talking about people, domestic abuse and sex offenders. But if there's domestic abuse in the home and a child has witnessed it or maybe in danger because of it, or if someone's a chronic substance abuser, Iowa law gives you the authority to remove a parent. And people didn't do it generally. It is a piece of our law that we just didn't go there. We just didn't do it. And now it's one of the tools that we regularly consider when we're looking at what's best for a child. The other thing I would say about district attorneys in Iowa, we call them county attorneys, is that we have the whole range in Iowa. We got some who are on board with Families First and who are working closely with the department and the court to try to make some of these changes. And we have some county attorneys, and I don't know if it's about power or if it's about the way we always used to do it. There's a lot of the apple didn't fall far from the tree, or oh, I know this family. And I mean, there are a lot of, but there are some county attorneys who believe they personally have some way of seeing into the heart of some facts and that they are more right than anyone else. And then we have some excellent county attorneys who are using their discretion in conjunction with the department and trying to work with families. So we have the whole gambit. It's so interesting to me because we used to always say that children are best in families, but we never acted like we believed it. And so many county attorneys who are stuck in their ways are like, we've always said family, we've always said children belong in families, but we've also always said safety first. And this idea that we can have safety and protection and not remove is a harder sell for some than others. And the proof has been in the pudding for me. I mean, the success stories of kids who never have to know a mortal wound because we can't fix it, as Amelia tells us. We can't fix it. So I always say to those county attorneys, rule number one, do no harm. And so, you know, sometimes when you're the court, you get to say to them, back off.
Judge Nickel and Janae, thank you so much for joining us today, for the work that you're doing in Iowa, for your time today. And again, like Janae said, this is just a piece of the things that they're doing. And I know that we all have hopefully a multi-pronged strategy. We are going to shift gears here. We want to make sure that Isabel Blanco has some time to also talk about other things that we can employ, other ways, other approaches, other things to think about as we develop these really important relationships and with our judges. So Isabel Blanco, we offer you the time and the podium. And as you pull up your slides, perhaps you're doing that now, I will just say, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, Isabel Blanco is our Managing Director of Transformational Change at ALEA, and she has a history of many different areas of child welfare in the state of leadership in the state of Georgia, in the state of South Carolina. She was at Casey Family Programs for a very long time, and in housing, and on and on and on. So she will bring all those perspectives to us, and I'll give it to you, Isabel.
Oh, thank you, Katie. It is always such a pleasure to listen to Janae and an honor to listen to Judge Nichols. So I feel it's such an honor to be able to follow them. I also want to acknowledge a couple of people in the squares that are so important to me. I want to send a shout out to my dear friend Lynn Bragg, who has done tremendous work with the courts. Of course, my respected colleagues, Sheldon Spotted Elk and Anita Feinday for Casey Family Programs, people whose work I admired and have learned a lot from. As Katie mentioned, I have a history in leading jurisdictions towards change and have accomplished some things I can be proud of. Certainly those things were in the past, and there are things that I learned from, and there are things that I wish I had. So I am going to talk a little bit about what are the general takeaways from the work that accomplished two things. One in Georgia, we accomplished a 50% reduction over 4 years of children in care. And in South Carolina, we increased the number of kids that were adopted by 50% for those that had been waiting the longest. So we took kids that were waiting for adoption for 2 years or more and moved an increase of 50% of them in 2 years. And I want to give you the general parameters, how that was accomplished, what I didn't have and wish I had, and some more current considerations. First, I want to acknowledge that none of my experiences during the COVID years, and that is an additional degree of difficulty to the work today, which I think those of you who are working in that context today have additional challenges and, honor the difficulty that brings. So let me begin by putting something up, and I, like my friend Janae, cannot see you once I am in the slideshow, so please bear with me. I want to acknowledge the vital role of the courts. There is so much work that's been done over the years by these organizations, the Conference of Chief Justices, the Conference of State Court of Administrators, the American Bar Association, the Center for State Courts, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, who is now, I think, leading with their commitment to reduce disproportionality and disparities through the courts and innovative change initiatives. I also want to call out their bench cards, which can be seen on their website, which very much aligns with what Iowa is doing. Judges have created bench cards for just about every situation a judge encounters, with a list of questions that they could call on. So that is a tremendous resource. One of the things I love about Iowa, that it is a very succinct set of questions. If you like to look at bench cards that have much more extensive questions, you might check those out, especially for issues that are prevalent in your jurisdiction. I also want to call upon the work of the Pew Commission on Children in Foster Care and the tremendous work that they have done, especially with judicial summits over the years in inspiring court innovation. As we look at the issue of improvements, I really want to call the Judge William Byers of South Carolina, who reminds us about this urgent call because in these types of discussions, because children can't wait. Here's what he said that I will never forget. He said, children are stuck in a system that were designed for adults. And it comes down to this belief that we need to look at this system through a children's eyes. I would say through my child's eye, not just a child, but a child that you deeply care about, because it's looking at it through their eyes that we could see something very different than what we might see as professionals. So I begin our exploration by fully owning this unique and powerful responsibility as we carry out this work. There's a couple of things I want to mention. That the courts have a responsibility to ensure that no child gets into foster care unnecessarily and doesn't stay too long for their safety. And I like that perspective, because staying too long and being moved too often, as Judge Nichols called the pond, is one of the most risks to safety that often doesn't get weighed when we discuss these issues. As you brought up already, the risk tolerance is a topic that deserves attention and deserves sufficient time to explore. It was one of the things that I encountered most in my experience. It was lack of risk tolerance when we began to do the work and began to have results that really created difficult political situations about whether the numbers in reduction was really about wanting to get rid of some cases, or whether it was really following the value that children are always going to be better off if they can safely remain at home. And so the community of people talking in regards to this risk tolerance, I would say it's one of the things that really deserve a lot of attention, and only you can gauge given the experience in your own community. I would also say that reasonable efforts or no reasonable effort findings are the most powerful tool that the court has. And perhaps often we see that where progress is not being made, that there is almost a default position that reasonable efforts were reached, or that reasonable efforts were not reached, and we move on anyway. And so even that dialogue and looking at the data from that perspective is really a very important issue to take into account. Some courts have approached this powerful tool with a really high degree of engagement, not just to make a finding, but to really engage in galvanizing the community and the resources to ensure that the families can actually effectively receive these reasonable efforts. My experience and everything I want to say to you today has really four main points. That there is a clear and unquestionable responsibility by the court to galvanize these resources, and how they do it makes a terrific effort. The work that we did in Georgia and South Carolina could not have been possible without court leadership. That is absolute bottom line truth. The executive branch alone does not carry the influence to be able to do that. And so we need strong partnerships. The critical need to utilize the data that talks to us about the outcomes in disproportionality or other disparities is absolutely critical. I want to point to fosteringcourtimprovement.com, whose mission is to provide every state with an ability to see systemic data, not just by county or state or national, but by judicial areas, which is really important for judges to be able to analyze their outcomes in their particular area and be able to compare them with other judicial areas in their state. The third point is that you need to have a clear plan of action. I want to talk about that, both from where some efforts begin as new efforts and what has been proven to actually work, because that's really important. And finally, is that this system requires, and I would underscore, demand strong checks and balances for improved outcomes. That the foundation of those checks and balances are strong collaborative relationships. And in cases where we can show the most outcomes, like we just heard in Iowa, it is the collaborative relationships that really form this platform for innovative ideas. As with any initiative, the devil's in the details, and so I want to talk to you about some of those details. And we at ALEA believe not only in highlighting these practices and relationships and outcome, but really the work of bringing together leadership. That doesn't always happen naturally. We believe it must be nurtured and supported in order to have those places that want to implement new practices actually learn from what has happened and develop their own answers to them. What I want to do is to highlight two localities, and not South Carolina or Georgia, something that one was seminal in the learning of what to do over time, and the other is something I really wished I had had, and that is the Safe Babies Court project. And I want to talk some about that because the outcomes are, to me, so significant that it really requires knowledge and importance. The other is to identify for you two Pew Foundation findings that still require much attention from the courts and provides an opportunity for us to do that. And two, some thoughts on court leadership and critical steps towards advancing racial equity and disparities through collaborative inquiry. Let's take a look at this issue, the data, specifically a population that should have our greatest attention. Infants and young children are the most vulnerable to abuse and neglect. And more than 1/4 of the victims are victims under 3. This is really important because that mortal wound that Judge Nichols talked about for those children under age 3, what we know now about brain science and child development is that those things could be coped with, they could try to be addressed, but they're never going to be resolved. They will shape the experience of that child for the rest of their lives. And so this population is really important. And certainly the length of time and the multiple placements that they experience. So let me talk a little about Safe Babies court teams. It's an administrative, so when I watched it clearly in Broward County, Florida, certainly Judge Bristol was instrumental, as most judges are, in causing really innovative changes. She saw two things that really bothered her. First, that the same families repeatedly experienced the removal of her children. That's the reentry data. And certainly re-abuse data has a lot of insight to provide for that. And second, that youth formerly in care were reappearing as young parents with infants. So this cycling of these same families through the court began to identify for her that something different needed to be done. When you add that to the 0 to 3 impact, this really became important. So Judge Bristol does something that is most instinctive, I think, to most judges, because when the judge calls, people show up. Sometimes when I was the child welfare director and I called people, most people showed up if I was funding them. If not, it depended on whether they agreed or had something they needed to talk about. But when judges call, most people show up. And so she called parents' attorneys and the Foster Parent Association and the Child Welfare Agency and other providers to develop a plan. And after 6 months of careful consideration, they chose the Safe Babies Court team approach. Why? Because it focuses on minimizing trauma and its impact on early development by improving court processes. And that is hugely important. It's important to shorten time, but this issue of minimizing trauma to me has become, I think, a priority. And in balance with the belief that safety relies in removal, which is a really permanent belief that we currently hold, that separation and safety go together. We rarely challenge. I'm glad that we're in a time that we can also say trauma is as important. And trauma relies mostly on safely maintaining the children with their families. It is a systemic change initiative. It is not a siloed approach. It has a more comprehensive approach to the impact it wants to have. And because of the results it has gotten, it has spread since 2005 to 80 locations across the country. So we can now see real evaluation tied to this approach. It is both a family and systems level, as I mentioned. The family teams composed of the family members and everybody they deal with really talk about the actual experience of barriers from the family perspective to reunification and to helping expedite those services. It is really difficult for the court to move the child towards permanency when the parent hasn't been able to access quality services. If they're on a waiting list, there's nothing the court can do about that. If they are programs that don't actually make a difference, it is mostly checking off that I attended, but the court doesn't have any feedback that the parental capacity to protect, especially young children, have been enhanced. Not that they complied, but the actual capacity to protect has been impacted and improved. And then there's community court teams led by the judge and the stakeholders in the community to review patterns through data in cohorts of families regarding what is happening with them and where we're succeeding and where the challenges lie. So data plays a really important team in the community court teams. Let's talk a little bit about the outcomes.
Isabel, let me just interject. So we've got about 2 minutes, unfortunately, if you can imagine how fast that time went. And so I wonder if it's possible for you to just give us your last sort of wrap up thoughts on here. We'll make sure that the information that you had prepared can get to the participants, and then we'll stay on for a moment later to receive any chat questions.
Absolutely, Katie.
Wonderful.
So let me just go through these. You could see that improved safety, time to permanency. There was even improvement in racial equity and cost savings. I won't talk about Allegheny County and its seminal work with parent attorneys, but let me talk about 2 points that the Foundation still says needs addressing. One is to improve the court's ability to spot emerging trends, not just to react to something that's already happening, but to be able to anticipate and address in a proactive manner. The second is to have the voices of children and parents be heard. And there's a lot of great work being done, even in pre-petition work that I wish we had time to cover, right? But really ensuring that the court is able to hear the full information from the parent's perspective primarily is really key here. Last thing then I will finish up with Katie is saying some final thoughts on about how the court can add to the diversity conversation. I think that it is really difficult to say that there is nothing that can be done, but primarily there are initiatives that are really improving this work of looking at critical decision points with the courts and the data associated with them and asking questions. So the support of collaborative inquiry through data, especially with troubling and concerning evidence, such as Judge Bristol in Broward County experience, is essential. So I suggested just some initial questions and that might help, but certainly this collaborative inquiry being led by judges and supported by professionals who can provide support to these processes is essential. I'll end there, Katie.
Excellent. I know we could spend days on this. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Judge Nichol. Thank you, Janae Harvey, to everyone who showed up today. We will be sending out follow-up information. You know where to reach us. We can reach out to whoever else presented today and make sure to get your questions answered. We're going to save the chat. Do go to aliainnovations.org and sign up for our newsletter, and drink an extra glass of water today. Take care of yourself. We're so grateful for the work you're doing to keep families safely together. The team Alia will stand for just a few moments again to field any last inquiries, and then we'll sign off.